Okay, last but not least, we're going to move on to panel 4, and I'm going to turn it over to Kavitha Cardoza from WAMU, which is, I bet everybody in this room knows this, DC's NPR station. So, Kavitha, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a discussion about education and poverty. I'm Kavitha Cardoza. I'm a journalist and going to be moderating this panel. Everyone knows that journalists love a very clean storyline, right? You want it as simple as possible for your audience. Except when I cover stories about poverty, it's so tangled. Everything is so intertwined. There's transportation, health, hunger, housing, everything is kind of a mess. So to kind of help us tease everything out and try and understand what's going on when it comes to education, we've got 4 expert panelists. I'm going to start with Lawrence Aber. Larry is a distinguished professor of applied psychology and public policy at the New York University. He's an expert in child development and social policy and serves as consultant to the World Bank on their new project, Children and Youth in Crisis. A little detail about Larry is his wife and he have had children under their roof continuously for the last 36 years.
That's why you're in town. That's why you're here.
A little love, please.
Jane Hannaway is Vice President of the American Institutes of Research. She's an organizational psychologist whose work focuses on educational organizations, in particular the effects of education reforms on school policies and practices, and ultimately on school outcomes, student outcomes. Jane says the Washington Nationals have started to get her intrigued about baseball, which she says is a much more interesting game than she ever thought.
Can I tell the truth? I have a little crush on Bryce Harper. I confess, I have a little crush.
Wendell Hall is Deputy Director at the Institute for Higher Education Policy. He studies various higher education issues, including college access, higher education financing, and STEM initiatives. Wendell is a newlywed and recently celebrated his first wedding anniversary. Paul Osterman is the NTU Professor of Human Resources and Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's written several books and journal articles on the organization of work within firms, labor market policy, and economic development. He's a serious tennis player and a former professional soccer referee. By professional, he says he got paid to do high school varsity and adult amateur games. So welcome to our panel. We're going to get started. I thought we'd kind of divide our time up into what are the challenges, let's understand the problem, let's talk a little bit about solutions, and then we'll have time for question and answers. So part of the problem to me seems that families in poverty are struggling with immediate needs, and the whole goal of education is long-term. And so reconciling the two is a huge problem. So I've asked each panelist to give us a 3 to 5 minute, quick snapshot of how poverty intersects with their area of expertise. It's kind of like the basic TV question, right? Where someone sticks a mic in your face and says, "Why should we care?" This is it. So we're going to start with Larry.
Great. Well, thank you, Kavitha. And I'm a developmental psychologist by training. I study the development of children. And if Paul is a practicing member of the dismal science, I think of developmental science as the bright and science. He will never talk to me again. So we've heard today that the age group in America that has the highest probability of being poor is children. Poverty is a very complex phenomenon. We've heard that today. What are some of the ways that developmental science is learning both about how poverty affects children and poverty and its cofactors, the many things that go along with poverty, and what might be able to be done to ameliorate some of those situations? Well, you remember the public advertisement, "This is your brain." They showed an egg. "This is your brain on drugs," into the frying pan. Well, I want to start a new campaign, "This is your brain on poverty." Because poverty has an enormously debilitating effect on neurobiology and neuroanatomy, on our brain, on our stress and hormone system. And poverty slows the rate of growth of synapses in your brain, the connections between cells that allow us to learn. Poverty elevates, and things associated with poverty, which I'll list the three most toxic: enduring extreme stress, unpredictability and chaos, and violence. Those are not exclusively issues associated with poverty. They are issues that poor children and families face more frequently, probabilistically more frequently than other families. So those things have very debilitating effects, including elevating stress hormones in the body, cortisol, and being unable to use the stress hormone to regulate your attention and behavior as expertly over time. So there are actually things about the neurobiology and the physiology of the development of the human being from the very earliest moments of life that poverty has a direct impact on. And I will talk later, but I don't want to bogey too much time right from the beginning. I'm Irish, but I'm not that Irish. I want to talk later about the disproportionate public investments by age of children. So right now, America invests most in K-12 education. And the two big periods of life where we have many fewer public investments are post-secondary, which we've talked a lot about today, but also in the first 3 or 4 years of life. And I think the first 3 or 4 years of life could not be more influential. I think that early childhood education is thought of as preschool. And if we start thinking about picking up kids only at 3 and 4, we're way out of the ballpark. We have to be thinking about from conception on, and there are actually many exciting things to do, because everything I've said so far is doom and gloom. My wife always calls me Mr. D and G, Mr. Doom and Gloom. The other thing, reason I'm calling developmental science the bright science, is because the other thing we've discovered is about the enormous plasticity of human beings, the enormous ability to recover function and to change positively after insults, not just live with the negative effects. So I think those are some of the things that we might be able to talk about.
Jane?
Poverty and education, it's a big one. Family background is the most important factor in any statistical study affecting student achievement. So it's not something that goes on in this school, it's what goes on outside the school. So that's number one. To make it worse, over the last 5 decades, recent research has shown that the difference between the kids from families coming from the top 10% in terms of income to the bottom 10% has doubled. So in the last 5 decades, the difference between the top and the bottom in terms of family income has doubled. This gap in achievement by income is larger than the gap in achievement by race. And to top it off, sort of the cherry on the cake, is that we're at a state in our economic development where the returns to education are increasing. So that means things are getting worse in terms of disparity rather than better, to the extent that kids aren't getting the education that they should. What I spend my professional life doing is trying to figure out how different education policies and practices intervene and largely try to offset this differential, the advantage that kids from better, more well-to-do homes get. And some of these policies, I'll just sort of list through them, and I'm sure we'll get them later. One, accountability policies, both at the school level and at the teacher level, are policies that in the U.S. have been, are currently very active Secondly, there are market-based policies, sort of choice policies, charter school policies, the idea being that individuals can better sort themselves among schools with different characteristics, as well as that these market-based policies will lead schools themselves to work harder through competition. Another policy change, teacher training. It's sort of a hot area right now in the U.S. We have 1,500 teacher training institutions across the country of highly variable quality. And so there's a lot of effort being put in now to how do we go about training teachers and what do we do to develop teachers when they're on the job. And another area of policy, the final one, is the time and intensity, the amount of input that's given to students. So this is after-school programs, summer school programs, smaller class size, things to intensify the effort in order to make up for this differential, which again is getting worse and is going to be even more serious as time goes on, given the structure of the economy.
So let's move on to higher ed. Wendell?
Right, thanks. So I wouldn't have to say this to many of you all who have kids who are in college or recently finished college, or if you've recently finished yourself, but financing higher ed has taken center stage over the last few years, even more so over the last few months. However, this has always been a conversation piece for lowest income families, going back decades. Why is this important? We know that by income, the level of your income is directly correlated to the likelihood of you attending and also completing college. 34% of low-income kids attend college, only 11% complete college. 79% of higher income, and this is by quintile, families attend college, 53 complete. Why is this important? As President Obama has talked about in his 2020 goals, other foundations have put out college completion goals as well for the United States to remain competitive. This is very important for the country. We're not going to be able to reach these goals and stay competitive as a nation, only educating a small portion of our citizenry. This increase in prices, again, has taken effect over the last several decades, and that's one of the major drivers why poverty is directly correlated with students going to school or going to college. However, there are other factors as well. Taking some of the academic issues that we often see with lower income populations, they show themselves when a student enters college, but we know that many of those issues start well before a student enters college. And how it relates to poverty, oftentimes it relates directly by resources. If you're a lower income family or someone who grows up in a lower income community, it's much more likely that you're going to grow up in an under-resourced environment, and that's going to manifest itself over the 10 to 15 years in which you're in the K-12 school system, and it's also going to show up once you get to a college campus. So poverty, we oftentimes in higher ed don't think about what happens to a student or what happened to a student before they showed up at the door, but it's a huge factor in whether or not a student's going to come in prepared and whether or not the college is going to help them get through to the degree. So I'm sure we'll talk about it more in depth as we continue with the conversation.
So moving on along the continuum.
Right, I'm not sure how you define the continuum, but from the optimistic to the dismal.
That's only the profession, Paul.
That's actually probably the personalities too. So I'm a little different here in this panel. So I'm interested in the following problem. For an adult who's grown up and gotten out of school and is working in a low-wage job, what role is there for education and training to help him or her get out of that low-wage job into better circumstances? So it's a somewhat different formulation. Now, let me be clear that I don't think that education and training is the only policy lever. There's always going to be people making beds in hotels, chopping lettuce in kitchens, doing those kinds of jobs. If you could wave your magic wand and give them all a community college degree or a 4-year degree, their wages aren't going to go up, right? There's always going to be those jobs, and so there's a set of policies you need to think about to improve those jobs independent of education and training. But education and training is an important part of the puzzle. So here's the kind of parable, but this is actually not a parable. So you've got someone working in a hospital, and he or she is working in a laundry, making $9 to $10 an hour in the hospital laundry. They go into a job training program that's organized by an intermediary that helps arrange this program. The hospital plays along with it, provides some time off, provides some resources. Person gets some basic training, improves their literacy, math skills, goes into community college, gets a 2-year degree, and becomes a medical technician of some kind. And now they're making $20 an hour. So in fact, that's the kind of happy story, right? That's what you could think about as kind of the paradigmatic, canonical kind of story of what you could kind of do. So what does it take to make that happen? Well, it takes an employer who's willing to be cooperative and who's interested in this outcome for their employees. It takes a good program, kind of a best practice program that knows how to both work with employers and to work with training institutions and understands the kinds of needs that the previous panel talked about in terms of support to help that person go through what's a fairly lengthy process. It takes a community college which is flexible, able to kind of adjust the hours of its programs, to work with the employers to do this. And it also takes an employer, and it has high quality training, the community college, and it also takes a setting, a workforce in which there's a natural job ladder. You can move up, okay? So that's the good story. So what are the challenges? Why doesn't this happen every day? Well, first, there's been I would argue, we could talk about this, a substantial decline, long-term decline, in employer willingness to invest in their workforce, in their frontline workforce, for a whole set of reasons. And that's a real problem. Secondly, there's not enough of these good intermediaries, best practice programs out there, partly a problem of kind of understanding what works well and what doesn't work well, and partly a problem of resources. Third, there are some very good community colleges out there, but as Harry Holzer mentioned when he talked earlier in the day, the completion and success rates in community colleges is not anywhere near where we would want it to be. Fourth, it takes time for that person to do this, because that person has a life, and that life has a lot of ups and downs, and you need the kinds of supports the previous panel talked about. And finally, there's a problem here in Washington, which is this kind of widespread view that nothing works, that employment and training doesn't work, all these programs are failures. And that's a widespread view. And it's wrong, but it's an obstacle. So as you think about kind of how you make that parable happen, I've seen the parable. It's not a parable, it's real. But how you make it happen at scale, you have to address each of these challenges and find some ways to deal with them and to get around them. And that's kind of the policy agenda. The other policy agenda is there are people who are, you don't want them to stay in that same firm and climb a ladder, either because it's a lousy firm or because the structure doesn't have a natural progression ladder, and you need to adjust what I've just described to help them move between firms. It's a similar story, but it's a somewhat different set of policy tools. So that's my deal.
So moving back to early childhood education, Larry, I had interviewed a 19-year-old once who had a 5-year-old daughter, and I went to interview her, knocked on the door. From the outside, the building looked fine. When I walked inside, there was nothing. No furniture, like there wasn't even a fridge. There was no electricity. This was in the middle of winter. There was one bed. And she opened the door and got into bed and pulled the covers over her, and the 5-year-old behind her. The child was not enrolled in any kind of schooling. And I thought, I was wondering, where do I even sit to do this interview? And I was thinking, you know, I often think back and wonder about that 5-year-old and wonder, what are her life outcomes going to be? Is she ever going to catch up coming from that background with so few resources?
Well, you raise a bunch of important points in that question, Kavitha. I'm going to focus on two. The first is we've been talking about income poverty and asset poverty and things like that. There is also in America material deprivation, and the main way we've talked about it today is food insecurity or hunger, but poor and very, very unstable housing, a whole bunch of things like that. Research has pretty much clarified now that poverty has one kind of effect on your young girls' cognitive and academic achievement through the ability of income to purchase experiences and good things to help them learn. Preschool, computers, trips to museum, books. And we've been calling that the family investment pathway from low income to educational, cognitive, academic achievement. There's a second pathway. Not all families that make the same income are equally materially deprived. Material deprivation and unpredictability create parental stress. Parental stress creates challenges to parenting, where parents might be more harsh. They might have a harder time paying attention to their children sometimes. And those pathways go to children's social emotional development. So poverty is not poverty is not poverty. There's issues of depth of poverty, but there's issues of what goes on with it. Family systems and children are complex enough that that's part of it. The other thing that you're raising is children's future life chances. Way before 5, children's life chances begin to diverge. And I'll just give one figure. By age 3 to 4, middle and upper income children have a working vocabulary that's about 3 times as large as low income children, a working vocabulary. So if I put this half of the room into the group that says, you get to use 1/3 of your words today, and this half and say, you get to keep all of those words that you use today, how much would you have learned today? There are very early appearances of differences, and it's absolutely irrational for us to invest as little in the first 3 years of life as we do, given how profoundly influential they are into the future.
Jane, often when we talk about accountability in the K-12 system, right, especially in DC, I mean, we are right up there when it comes to child poverty. 30,000 children living in poverty, and we're a kind of teeny tiny city. We have, and when we talk poverty, it's $22,000 a year for a family of 4. So we are really kind of, these children are almost have nothing. When we talk about, oh, once they get to school, we can improve their outcomes, I'm wondering, we spend a lot compared to other jurisdictions on per pupil spending, and yet our outcomes are not very good. How do we improve accountability for our low-income children?
Well, we also spend a lot relative to other countries. So this is a national problem, not just a DC problem. And I think it compels us to start looking at the system as a whole. And where do we put our dollars, and are they well put? I think the accountability movement has raised some serious questions about this. No Child Left Behind started out looking at school level accountability. The action now in policy circles is teacher level accountability. The fact of the matter is that variation within schools in terms of classroom performance and classroom academic gains is greater in most studies than the variation between schools. So with these sorts of findings that have been replicated and replicated and replicated, that have started to move the accountability focus more to the teacher level, which is very controversial. And if you think about where we spend our dollars in education, about 80% of the dollars go into human capital, into people. It's a human capital enterprise. A large fraction of it to teachers whose salaries go up with experience and whose salaries go up with credentials. When we try to figure out, okay, well, what are the payoffs to these investments? Because there certainly is a tremendous amount of face validity that experienced teachers would be more effective than inexperienced teachers. We don't find that. So there's very little payoff to this huge investment we're making in experienced teachers. Similarly with credentials. We don't see the payoff to credentials. So I think the accountability system is starting to target us in identifying places where we probably can be more efficient and more effective, figuring out how to do that in a political and policy way, I think is a real challenge. But that's where accountability is pushing us.
Wendell, I had gone to, this was a high school, a charter school, which was helping kids learn a skill as they went to study. And they were taking some of our most needy kids, right? So seniors who were reading at the 2nd grade level. And so it was very hard to even get kids to interview because, I mean, some of them could not, you couldn't like, they couldn't kind of form sentences. So this was the school population. And all of them said to me, college is the answer. I want to go to college. You know, our lives will change when we go to college. And it was so clear they didn't understand what it meant. I just felt so bad for them. And I feel that sometimes this happens where that's an extreme case. But our children or kids that I interview, you know, it seems like they go to college, they take out huge loans, they think that that's the answer. They're totally behind schedule when it comes to what they should be knowing. And then they drop out and they feel like failures. And so how do we improve access and completion rates when it comes to college?
Well, first, I think it would be very difficult to improve access and retention rates using that example, as you said, because it is very extreme. I think the majority of low-income students do not necessarily fit that mold, although many times folks assume that low-income students do fit that mold. They're completely unprepared, they're not motivated, and that's not necessarily the case. And I say that speaking for myself, who was a Pell Grant recipient growing up myself earlier. So, to improve degree completion and access, a few things can be done, and it has to be a very comprehensive approach. Oftentimes in the higher ed world, we talk about things that are very piecemeal. This group can do this group can do that. We have to begin looking at some of our transfer and articulation policies. So that's one way. So we know the student that we see in higher ed now is more overwhelmingly what we used to call the non-traditional student. That student is more now the traditional student. Most students don't go to a 4-year residential college campus and stay there for 4 years. Most students actually attend more than one institution. So we have to begin working with the new group of students who are populating our campuses. We also know that more often, lower income students are more likely to start at a 2-year college versus a 4-year college. So if you're starting at a 2-year college, let's make sure, as you said, when you enter, you have the correct information that you need so that the institutions can help you get where you ultimately want to go. Judging a student's intent. Is your intent to obtain a degree, a certificate, transfer to a 4-year to get a 4-year bachelor's degree? I think that's also important. If we we need to allow institutions to create not just an academic environment for students, but also those wraparound services, academic, but also social supports, especially when we're talking about lower income students who haven't had the exposure, or mom and dad who went to school and they have the social and cultural capital of what it means to be in college. The students you just talked about, to get back to the example, we do have a national narrative now that anyone who prepares adequately and wants the opportunity should be able to go to college, and that's something that we agree with at IHEP as well. However, in that example, those students were failed by the system, potentially by communities, and by so many others well before they said we want to go to college. But it's also important to remember, since we don't have the same traditional population that we used to have, there are opportunities for students who graduate high school, and hopefully in this situation the student would, and to return to college years later and now be in a different mindset and see college as a different type of investment. It may not be a 4-year school, it may be a certificate, it may be something more aligned with workforce training. But we have to continue to provide these opportunities for lower income and underrepresented students. Otherwise, they'll be left at the door from a system that failed them when they were much younger. So.
Yeah, I didn't mean that they were not motivated, because otherwise they wouldn't still be in school. We have a lot of kids who have stopped coming for whatever reason. Paul, I wanted to ask you, it seems like I had done a piece on international education, and a lot of the other countries, it seems, Switzerland, Germany, some of the European countries, have they had businesses helping write curriculum. They were very much part of the school system. I mean, there was it seemed far more integrated. Like the point of education was, you know, eventually you're going to be in the workforce. And people over here would say, oh, that's a huge gap here. Do you agree? What can we do to better connect what students are learning?
Right. So I think it's a complicated question. So first off, there's more to education than jobs, right? I mean, education teaches people to be good citizens. They teach them to have a rich life in a variety of ways. You know, I think you want to be careful about a rhetoric that completely vocationalizes education. So let me just say that. I think that's an important point, seriously. Having said that, it's clear that on issues of getting people into good jobs that you want to find a way to help education connect people better into the world of work. The employment and training programs historically in the United States have been kind of isolated from employers. They've kind of trained people and thrown them over the walls. Now that's changed. That's changed. It's understood that you need to kind of do better than that. There's kind of a good way and a bad way to connect job training and schools to employers. The bad way is this rhetoric that employers know best, employers or business people know how to manage systems in business-like ways that these public servants don't understand. That's just wrong. First, public servants do understand. Secondly, the skills involved in managing a system, a public system, like a training system or a school system, are very different than the skills involved in running IBM or your local automobile dealer. So there's kind of a bad rhetoric around that. The good rhetoric is what works well. So at the high school level, career academies work well. They motivate people. They provide connections to jobs. At the community college level, a number of community colleges now have various very clear occupational tracks. About 50% of students in community colleges are in these occupational tracks. The rate of return is much higher in these occupational tracks. Too many community college students are not in these tracks, and those are the ones who drop out and flunk and leave because they're lost in that system. Community colleges, good ones, are much more entrepreneurial with respect to their employer community in their region. So there's a way to do that at the community college level. And in the kind of job training, employment training system, that kind of parable I talked to you at the beginning, the kind of best practice intermediary is one that kind of looks in both directions, works with the firm's human resource system, and works with the folks. So there is good practice around all this stuff. And again, it's a question of diffusing it and giving it the proper level of resources, but not falling into the kind of the rhetoric that, you know, we should turn the system over to people who, because they know how to run their firm, they know how to run the school system or a training program. That's the wrong way to go, I think.
What would you want changed if you had to prioritize? What would make a huge difference? And I'm going to ask you all to not maybe not just more money, because I know everyone always says, oh, more money. It doesn't look like anyone's going to...
More money.
We can stipulate to that.
Within, you know, the amount of money we have now, how would you change things? What should we be doing smarter?
Well, earlier this morning, several people were talking about relatively shorter-term strategies and relatively longer-term strategies. I'm going to begin with the longer-term strategy because, as my comments already indicated, I think one of the most important things to change is the level of public investments in the first 4 years of life and post-secondary. That is where there is a resource wasteland compared to K-12, or in some states pre-K-12 now. So, and I do think we could put ourselves on a course over 20 years to add increments in public investment in the first 3 years of life. The interstate transportation system wasn't built in a day. We laid the roads, and over successive administrations, we made public investments in an interstate transportation system that built the country. We need to make long-term investments in developing the developmental infrastructure. It's educational, but it's not just education in the first 3 years of life, to take care of the first 3 years of life. And I can talk more about that. But that's, over the long term, that is going to pay dividends. But that's a long-term strategy. I've been trying to develop such a system for 20 years, as many people in the room have, and we don't do it at any quick pace in this country. So 3% of income-eligible children for early Head Start, the 0 to 3 program that is the flagship of the federal government, 3% of the income-eligible children receive early Head Start. It would be an enormously expensive thing to expand early Head Start. It would be a good thing to do. We're not going to do that now unless we have the kind of public works, care economy, investing in jobs, in care jobs, that would allow us to make sense of those kinds of infrastructure investments in the first 3 years of life. So my short-term solution is going to sound odd to some people, but what the heck. The only universal platform that reaches all low-income infants and toddlers in this country is the health system. The pediatric and primary and preventive health care system. The Affordable Care Act is going to just about make that a universal system if it's implemented in the ways that it was intended. And I think that the early health system has to become an early health and learning system. And it's not that hard to do. There are programs like something called the Video Interaction Project. The Video Interaction Project has a paraprofessional child development person, bachelor's level trained person, videotape a parent and child for about 15 minutes before a pediatric visit, and then has the child and the parent come back to review the tape for 15 minutes after the pediatric visit. And the child development specialist does two things. They point out places where there were positive emotional exchanges between the infant or toddler and the parent, or where there could have been and there weren't, and they positively reinforce doing that. And they point out places where there's verbal exchanges, and they support and reinforce that. That improves that cuts by half the vocabulary gap I just described to you. Good randomized clinical trials. There are things that we can do that are relatively low cost, relatively high impact within the health system that would help children get ready to be school ready. They're not school ready because we don't even make them preschool ready for the reasons we just described. So those are some of the kinds, and there are many other things like that. I think we can invest in we want to strengthen our major platforms like Medicaid and things like that. And then we want to make them, as somebody said today, we want to reform them to make them even more impactful and even more nutritious. I think there's lots of promising approaches there.
It's interesting. Some of our schools have training kind of programs for parents to get them more involved. And one of the things they said was a lot of the parents would tell their children, if their kids were kind of running around, they would say, you know, sit down and be quiet. And they would teach them that that kind of shuts down the learning process. When kids ask questions, that's how they learn. And the parents had just never thought of that. They were thinking it was a discipline thing. So, Jane, what about you?
3 T's, toddlers, teachers, and technology. So first I want to back up what Larry's saying with a slightly different argument. Education is cumulative. So when you look at performance of kids over time, and this is with, remember, heavier and heavier, more and more investment by education, the disparities in performance increase. And that's because some kids are entering school ready to learn, and they start taking off on a different trajectory than other kids who aren't ready to learn. I mean, like the mantra in education circles is that you learn to read till 4th grade, and after 4th grade, you read to learn. So we can predict, based on how well kids are doing in 4th grade, the likelihood of their dropping out. So these early investments have, multiplier effects over time. So I really want to reinforce that. The second thing is teachers, and I talked about it a little bit before, but it's the most important school factor affecting student performance. And the variation, as I said, is within school. The differences in what's called value added, which is the extent to which the teacher contributes to learning gains, is measured by test performance, and it's controversial, but the differences are huge. So you have teachers in the top 15th percentile that are getting about a 1.5 year gain for their kids on average. Teachers at the bottom 15th percentile getting about a 1/2 year gain. So you can imagine what happens to some of these kids coming from poverty backgrounds who a couple years in a row get one of these low performing teachers. So we have to do something about reorganizing how we manage, how we select, develop, and manage human capital in education. And the third thing is technology. And here I have less to say substantively. However, I think the fact of the matter is that education is one of the few industries where we haven't yet seen the returns to technology. You know, it's still very much this human person-to-person business, and it probably has to be to a larger extent than many other areas. The whole thing can't be automated. At the same time, there's all sorts of ways to build in quality control with technology, to build in professional development and all sort of scaffolding for teachers with technology. In the higher education level, there are all these new firms that are starting that are doing online courses at post-secondary that could be opening up options for kids. So I think 3 things: toddlers, teachers, technology.
Wendell.
With the risk of sounding like an echo, I'll also say that every child truly have an opportunity. I think, as we just spoke about on the panel several times, we say that, but we know what happens in kindergarten, 1st grade, or at 2, 3, 4 years old, that too often for too many kids, that's where their opportunities are squandered. Not completely, but it's going to take so much for them to catch up over time. So that's number 1. In order to do so, I won't say money, since we're not to say money, but I think a shift in resources. I think we spend lots of money in this country on other things, and at least from a federal perspective, education budget is small relative to some other items in which we spend our money. So I think shifting...
That begs the question, what would you cut, Wendell?
I didn't say I would cut anything. I was just thinking. We can ask the audience to give some suggestions. But I think a shifting of our resources to truly make the investment that we need would help. And also I think something else that's more tangible as well is more state, federal government partnerships around higher ed. And I think this would be in states' best interests because this is going to be their educated citizenry once these students do finish and go into the job market and create jobs, and then just be better citizens overall. So states and the federal government have had partnerships over time, but it has not been something that's been comprehensive, and we know that states have to balance budgets. So in times like this, where states have to draw back from higher ed, draw back from access programs, and supporting their students, that investment shifts. So if there's one thing I can say, it would be that dual partnership between the federal government and states, but ultimately that every child at least have an opportunity. So.
Are there any states where it's working well?
Where it's working?
The governments are aligned and it's working well.
That's an on-the-spot question. There are certain programs, there were certain financial aid programs where the federal government and states worked together to supplement some of the financial aid policies. It's not as widespread, and I can't name one state where it's working well right now off the top of my head.
Interesting. Paul?
So 3 things I guess I would change. One is just this perception in the policy community that you can't effectively mount job training programs for adults, that the rates of return are low, that you can't do it. That is a perception, and it's really deleterious in terms of federal budgeting and to some extent in terms of the foundation world. Secondly, I'd think a lot about the articulation among elements of the system. So the elements of the system are, for example, adult basic. Again, I'm talking about adults here, not younger people. Adult basic education is one element of the system. Community colleges employment training programs, handoffs and articulation is very poor. And it leads to a lot of people dropping out and being lost as they kind of try and move up a ladder. And then thirdly, the community colleges. So our community college system is by far the most important element of our adult training system. Around 50% of all post-secondary enrollments are in community colleges, not on an FTE basis, but on a body basis. Lots of these people are low income. Lots of these people are minority. Lots of them are first-time people in their families to attend post-secondary. You can improve community colleges in a substantial number of ways. You could simplify the choices people face. You can improve the way remedial education is delivered, developmental education, to reduce dropout rates. There are a variety of ways to improve the quality of community colleges that would have a big effect on people, of concern in this panel.
Kavitha, if I may, I just want to link a couple of comments. Education is not just a status attainment. It's actually a process by which people learn. And I think some of the things that Paul is saying, it's very important to think that people can continue to learn in fundamental ways. And there's just tons of evidence that that people can continue to learn. Technology and teachers. In a certain way, I think we're doing value added around teachers. I agree with those two priorities as well. I think we're doing value added around teachers about only one of the jobs of teachers, and that's the academic tests. There's been lots of discussion about soft skills, social emotional skills, job skills. There's a whole field of what's now called social emotional learning, a huge evidence-based field, about 200 studies, 200,000 kids over 20 years, and it actually shows that social emotional learning interventions in schools not only improve children's ability to regulate their behavior, reduces their anxiety and their mental health problems, it has about a 0.2 to 0.22 effect size in achievement test scores, which is about as good as cognitively based achievement test scores. We want to educate the whole child in that respect. That means that the teacher has to be prepared to do that. So from my point of view, we should be evaluating teachers on their ability to provide a cognitively stimulating and coherent learning environment, and to be emotionally supportive and growth producing. And it is now possible to observe teachers in their classrooms on those dimensions and actually have performance ratings of them that are not, and if you add them and you actually add students' perceptions of their teachers, if you add both of those to the value added scores, you increase the predictability of how children are going to learn. So teachers have complex jobs. They're teaching whole children, and we want to evaluate and hold them accountable on multiple dimensions. I suspect James agrees. Yeah.
If I can add one thing to that, as a former high school science teacher, I think as we do hold teachers accountable and make sure they're teaching the whole child, we also have to make sure that teachers who are going into this line of work are not being unfairly penalized for teaching the same population of students that we're talking about today. Because it's pretty easy to go to a higher income neighborhood and teach students and get higher gains as a teacher. But we want those teachers, we want all teachers who are motivated to work with this population to do so, and to work with the lower income population specifically.
I mean, in DC alone, the highly effective teachers, as scored by the district, there are many, many more in the higher income schools than in the lower income schools, and that's where they're probably needed the most. So we're about at time for a few questions. Just raise your hand, and I think someone will come round with a. Is there a mic? Yeah. Okay.
There's someone there.
Why don't you stand up and introduce yourself?
My name is Laura Burnson. I work for Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon. One of the questions I had that just didn't come up, which was surprising to me, was there hasn't been any discussion of the lack of data in terms of analyzing teacher effectiveness, student effectiveness, school effectiveness. We talk about accountability in K through 12 pretty often, and I'm not advocating for No Child Left Behind for post-secondary, but what does accountability mean for post-secondary, and should there be carrots and sticks in our, community college higher ed system that encourage accountability there too.
Wendell, do you want to take that?
Yes. There are several higher ed initiatives to begin thinking and talking about accountability within higher ed. I'm pretty sure that most higher professionals don't want a No Child Left Behind type of law imposed within higher ed. So I know there's the voluntary system of accountability put on by 2 of the higher ed associations. I know that, of course, the book that was written by Roxham and Josa and Roxham last year, Academically Adrift, many people have read that book and say, you know what, our students aren't learning anything. But I think before we get to that point that our students aren't learning much, we have to back up and say exactly what are we measuring. And I think that goes back to your question. Are we measuring all students? What dimensions are we examining? And what does it really mean to not learn in higher ed? Many of the accountability efforts right now that are going on in higher ed are happening at an institution level. So you're only measuring 200 or 300 students versus if you were a biology major or an engineering major happening within your specific school, which would seem to make a lot more sense. So the data aren't there. Sometimes we need more data, sometimes we need better data, and sometimes we don't need more data to come to the conclusions that are necessary. So I'm not sure if I answered your question or what the exact question was. You can repeat.
Let me just add a couple things. I mean, one is we have some recent history about an effort to introduce accountability, which is what the Obama administration tried to do with proprietary schools, and the resulting, I don't know, I won't use an adjective, but the resulting events that came out of that effort. So you can see the extent to which there's going to be pushback, but there was an effort, right? That's number one. Number two, certainly on community colleges, almost all community colleges in this country are basically funded by average daily attendance, right? The number of people sitting in seats as opposed to graduation rates. So certainly on the face of it, you think you'd like to change that and shift a little bit, if not towards measuring learning, at least towards measuring graduation rates. There's a whole set of technical issues involving that. For example, a fairly large percentage of people in community colleges transfer to other schools or 4-year schools. How do you do? But there have been efforts, small efforts in a number of states to make a certain fraction of the community college budget dependent on graduation outcomes. And the Center on Community Colleges at Teachers College did an evaluation of those efforts. And what uniformly happened across the 3 or 4 states that tried that was that they were watered down. First off, the amount of the incentive was small relative to the budget, and so it didn't really affect behavior. And secondly, over time, the school system succeeded in reducing even further the incentive. So there's going to be enormous pushback on these sets of things. But the fault lies not entirely in the system, in the community college system, for example. So if you look at IPEDS data, IPEDS is the basic system, right? But the IPEDS data are deeply flawed, right? They measure only full-time students. They measure them over a limited period of time. And so it's a hard question.
And also, just to add one more thing to that, it's also important to measure the intent, especially of students attending 2-year colleges. We assume that all students who go to any college are there to earn the degree. And I don't think that's a bad assumption. However, if you talk to students, some students are going back to take 2 or 3 courses for their job.
Yeah.
So if they're looked at as a failure, who's failing? Their intent was to gain 2 or 3 courses. Their intent was to get one more class together for just general knowledge versus trying to attain a degree. So data can always be tricky.
Can I just follow up on this? To give credit where credit is due, the feds have invested over the last 4 to 5 years over $500 million in setting up longitudinal data systems. So that, and Harry and I are working with some partners with some of these data, but in some states now, you can track kids from elementary schools through secondary, through post-secondary, and into the labor market. So one of the big issues is what sorts of investments do you do for later students, especially older students who haven't had very much success in K through 12. And I think with the exception of some random assignment studies, I think we really don't yet have a good handle on that, partly because these data systems have never before been linked. So now we can actually look at, well, what are the skills that students are bringing into the community college, and then for those students, what are the payoffs associated with different investments? Because I think up until now, you know, community colleges have been to some extent flying blind, and students have been flying blind, haven't been getting the sort of advice that they could be getting about what are the payoffs for someone like them in different routes in community college.
Let's take the woman in black.
I'm Jessica Roach, and I'm with the American Friends Service Committee, and my background is in economic policy, not education, so I apologize if this question isn't expertly formed, but I guess I hear a lot about teacher accountability, measuring teacher effectiveness via test scores, and I heard you acknowledge the controversy around that. I guess I'm interested in the accountability of the education system overall, and I think that when we hear about holding teachers who aren't getting good results accountable, you don't hear a lot about what happens after that. And I think so many people assume that we'll just boot those teachers and find some better ones or something. I guess what I'm interested in hearing is about some programs that are effective in helping teachers who aren't getting great results become better. So if any of you know about any of those.
Well, one thing that I know about was recently published in Science. It's called My Teaching Partner, and it was developed by Bob Pianta, who at the University of Virginia. My Teaching Partner does what I described earlier. It videotapes teachers in classrooms. There are 10 dimensions that have to do with intellectual support, emotional support, and classroom organization and management. Those dimensions are codable objectively from videotapes. And then there is, it depends on the system, an online system for distance learning, or a system of within building supervision in which those tapes are reviewed and teachers are coached about how to improve things. Teachers can improve on those dimensions, and when they do, their children learn more. So those are, another example is individualized learning. We talk about being cognitively stimulating. If you have 24 second graders in a classroom, what's cognitively stimulating for Frankie isn't stimulating for Judy. And so the ability to use technology to rapidly assess children's learning rates on recent tasks and reassemble children into small groups that are known to be able to optimize their learning. That's an example of the use of algorithmic methods, you know, back office, computer-based, that don't change how Judy and Frankie feel about Jane, their teacher. My first grade teacher was named Jane. Did you teach in Baltimore in 1958?
It wasn't me.
Okay, it wasn't you. So and so I think that there are ways to promote that. I think we've been looking under the wrong street lamp. We lost the keys over there. The light was good here, so we looked there. The stuff is over there. That's my opinion.
This is a good news story. I mean, all these findings, I think, about teacher effectiveness and the variation in teacher effectiveness, I think have really spurred us to try to figure out how to improve it. Bob Pianta's work, I think, is exemplary and one of the few, though. So this is really new. If you go back, almost every piece of federal education legislation that went through always had this pot of money for professional development. As a country, we spend billions in professional development, and we don't spend it well.
They're one-off events. They aren't
typically
cumulative.
One-off events.
They aren't evidence-based. But other than that, they're fine.
They're very expensive. So the dollars are there, and it's only some of this new research since this real push to, what are we going to do with these teachers? Some of them just aren't doing it. That I think, people like Bob and a few others are coming up. But what we don't know, I taught for 1 year in a high poverty school, and often when I'm giving a talk, I explain that this was the hardest job I ever had to do well. Absolute hardest job I ever had to do well. The easiest job during those years, and I was not your first grade teacher, but during those years, it was the easiest job I ever had, in which you could just close your door, keep the classroom quiet, and get away with doing very little. Well, all of that has shifted, so I think we're still at the beginning edge about how to really push the system. Personally, I don't think every teacher can be made into an excellent teacher. I don't even think every teacher can be made into a moderately good teacher. I think we have a system in the US where there's very little selection up front. If you look at our economic competitors, especially the high performers, there's high levels of selection into the profession, very low level of selection into the teaching profession here. And that doesn't mean that some of those teachers who are low level themselves academically can't be good. But I think we're still sorting out, with a combination of better pre-service and selection, and a combination of new inputs in the classroom for the teacher and new scaffolding for the teacher. What percent, how many of them can we boost up? And those we can't, could end up being wonderful lawyers or accountants, or, that's not a joke. This is in Washington. But it doesn't mean that these aren't good people. And again, to sort of buttress some of what you've been saying, when I was teaching, I felt like I had to have all cylinders on high. I had to have the emotional IQ going at the same time the cognitive IQ going, trying to figure out why isn't this kid understanding it, and at the same time keeping the kids motivated. So it's these teachers who are these super teachers, they are real stars.
That's a good question from the gentleman at the back.
Hi, I'm Samuel Evola, and I'm interning this summer at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. In our first panel this morning, we mentioned, like 16-year-olds who see the way that the economy is, and people who are 20, 22, 24 who don't see the benefit of continuing school. And knowing that SES and family background is such a key player in education, part of that challenge is a cultural and social connection that the school systems seem not to be making with low-income communities like the one described earlier. So my question, I guess, is twofold. What can the schools and the school system do to bridge that gap? And then what would be the most effective ways for the schools themselves to be a positive agent in changing that culture that doesn't see a benefit to continuing on?
Jane?
Well, I don't know, but there are some charter school systems, sort of system of charter schools, like KIPP academies, that take it as their mission to be more than the font of academic learning for the student, and they set up their teachers that come in know that's what they're buying into. The scheduling is done that way, so that there are some schools that are trying to be, to a greater extent, substitutes for what may not be happening at home or on the street, which can be negative.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I do have a reaction to that. Now, I'm not an education expert, but there are my impression about the school reform movement is that it's focused very heavily on K through 12, pre-high school, or to somewhat less on pre-K, but not on the high schools, right? That's one kind of characteristic about the school reform movement. But the fact is, in my view, my somewhat non-expert view, this emphasis on, well, these kids are from bad backgrounds and they don't understand, blah, 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 is a cop-out. And the reason it's a cop-out is because there are examples of high schools which have worked extremely effectively in getting these kids into post-secondary education. So in a number of parts of the country, there's something called early college high schools in poor communities that link high schools to community colleges, and the transfer rate is quite effective, okay? Career academies are another example that have been random assignment evaluations, quite effective. In New York City, there's been a couple of examples of high schools which have been just transformed with a great deal of success in terms of achieving post-secondary education. So just like, the model, the kind of story of employment training that nothing works, I just don't think that's true. I think it's a question of...
And it's even more complicated than that. So for instance, one of the things that works is creating smaller schools.
That's the New York City model.
That's the New York City model. The Gates Foundation, I don't get any funding from Gates. If you do, close your ears. The Gates Foundation championed small schools. Then they developed a distaste for it.
Then they walked away from it.
And then they walked away from it. And then the evidence came in and supporting it. So there's a quixotic nature to school reform that's kind of like changing your shirt, between work and dinner or something like that. It's just, so I think those are real issues. But I do think that it is possible to do very progressive things in high school and secondary school.
And one quick follow-up to your question. It's all of our responsibilities to make sure that those students understand the benefits of higher ed. The evidence is clear. The benefits pay off in terms of job satisfaction, in terms of pay, in terms of lifelong earnings. And I don't think it lies only with the schools that these students attend. We talked earlier about these schools are under-resourced. They don't have the structures within the community that other schools have. So if we continue to put the onus only on the schools, everyone else can say, well, their school's the problem. It's up to all of us in this room, those of us who have benefited from higher ed, to make sure that in whatever work we do, we're translating that information.
Lifelong learning for lifelong earning.
There we go.
I've just got the red stop sign, so I'm hoping some of the panelists will be able to stick around for a few minutes to take, I know we had several hands up. If you haven't got your questions answered, maybe some of the panelists can stay behind and speak to you. But otherwise, thank you so much. I know this is the long of a very intense day, so thank you for sticking with us.